and you can look at our 2020 roster that never played, and you're like, Aaron Schroeder was probably like the one of the picks in the last 8. She was probably the second or third best player in the tryout at all, and she was a starting point. And I think someone looking outside was like, who is that? Like, that player is not that player. Like, I know these other names, but like for me, that was a starting point. Like, if your starting point is like me, like hybridy people, it affects downstream with those other things. If you're then, selecting for, like, to your point of like, I actually need a personality that's going to lead my team very quickly, right? That's another factor. It's like, okay, we did this, like, we're taking this handler, and everyone's like, why would you take that handler? It's like, you know what? That person actually is going to get everyone in line, is going to draw respect from both the men and the, women on the team, right? Like, there's all these other factors. And I think the starting point really affects downstream what happens. And so
Mm-hmm.
I would say my experience with most staffs is that they're trying to do a good job of that. You can argue that they don't, for sure. Like, and I'm really cognizant of that. But I think for me is like there's a lot of factors that are going into it. And then there's a negotiation, right? There's 3 teams, and like you want certain players and you don't, and there's horse trading that's happening. Like, I really want this person, I'm gonna trade you 2 for
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
And so I think there's that. I think
That's a good point. This one that I never think about.
yeah. And like, to me, like when I've talked to like newer coaches, I was like, do you know the matchups that you are going to have? Like, all these rosters out, you have to go into selection knowing that already. You have to be clear on what your philosophy, like, like Dutchy used to do 3 lines, right? Like a OD and a swing line. Like, that affects what it looks like. And suddenly, like, if you fill up your O line and then now you're looking for D people who can also play a little bit of O, like, that affects your decision making. I think there's also an aspect of representation, whether it's by teams. Like, I think like, you can look and some people get criticized the other way. It's like, why is this person on the roster? It was like, it's a national team. Like, people should get these opportunities. Like, national teams should feed our national pro, like our club teams. And I'm really, and so if you're starting from that point, it might be like, hey, we need at least, like, let's work hard to get 4 Bravos on this team, right? If that's your starting point, you start that point, then you're going to get criticized for something else for sure, right? And then I think the other black boxes there's a lot of folks that decline, like
Mm-hmm.
Spicer declined afterward, right? Like,
Yeah.
likely makes a roster. There's people, Bansfield declined. I actually think, like, there's people who were in the pool who didn't apply. There's all these things, sort of factors that can affect represent like team representation. And then, we had an experience that in 2016 that we took a lot of brute players, but the year before, Leanne and Cammy, all these top players were playing, in Chicago. And
Right.
I was like, you do a redistribution of this in a different year, right? Like, think about like what
That's a
pony
good point.
players, how many pony players migrated. So, I agree. Is like having quotas doesn't make sense. I think having safeguards and people around you to check your bias
Mm.
is really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of folks do that behind the scenes. And for sure, we could do a better job.
It's
I'm
an impossible task, though,
yeah.
for sure.
I'm curious too. This is kind of a deep conversation, but if this isn't a super deep question, I'm kind of curious if the East Coast what do you think? If the East Coast tryout was before the West Coast trials, would the roster be different? Like, because you're talking about like all these down chain effects, and like if you see someone at East Coast, you're like, oh, that guy. Like, you see Chris Kocher, you're like, oh, that guy. Like, obviously Chris is going to make it. Chris is incredible. But do you think the roster would have been different if East Coast was first and not West Coast?
I mean, I'm humble enough to say that, yeah, like, I think this process is highly subjective.
Mhm.
I don't think it's unfair. Like, I think people are trying to make it fair, but there's so
Yeah.
much, like the coaches are different. Like, they just went through one tryout, and then like our better coaches, right? Like, we get more reps at something. We've had situations where weather's super different. I would say, like, on the mixed field, the mixed play was better. Like, people played better together. I don't know what the reasoning is behind that. Like, I don't know if it's because of better coaching or what it was. Like, it could be like, there's a lot of Ring and Phoenix players that play a lot together, and so maybe that made it better. So there, there's so many factors, and I
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
think, you're trying to do a better job. Like, I feel like we should constantly be improving how we select. It's amazing how, like I say, there's a lot of like when you hear 5 people talk about play, there's a lot of like agreement, but there's some players where their folks are on the same field and they see completely different things, right? And it's all based on your assumptions and expectations, right? Like when I saw Spicer on the field, I wasn't watching his defense. Like, right? Like for me, I was like, I've already watched his defense. I'm watching offense. Like on the turn, what does he look like? But that's because I'm coming in with a thing was like, oh yeah, I'm already stipulating this other thing I'm looking for. But somebody else is watching that and I was like, oh, I didn't even note it. Right. Like, so I think there's all these sort of assumptions you go in and right. Like even if you watch one player and I said, and you're like, I told you they were 23. And you're like, fuck, that guy is good. And then I told you they were 29. You're like, right.
Yeah.
Right. Like you see exactly the same theme and yet your expectations is suddenly like, and like I talk about this in tryouts all the time, like people love the shiny new thing. Right.
Mhm.
Everyone likes a shiny new thing. And I like old weathered, I for sure. But so I think that's one of the things to consider is like, yeah. And probably in this room you have disagreements on players, right? And you watch them all the time and you're like,
all the
that
time.
guy is amazing. That guy sucks, right?